cases, eating and drinking utensils were soaked in blood. Ugh, wow. No wonder he's called the vampire, right? I mean, that's what's really ironic about that is if you watch any movies at all on vampires, vampires are not depicted as being these cannibalistic, horrific murderers. I mean, they are depicted as murderers, of course, but you don't see the gruesomeness that we see with Chase. In 79, he stood trial on 6 counts of murder, and in order to avoid the death penalty, the defense tried to have him found guilty of second-degree murder, which would result in a life sentence. Their case hinged on Chase's history of mental illness and the suggestion that his crimes were not premeditated. Now, you know how I feel about this. If you listen to any of my podcasts, you know how I feel about this. It is very common for those convicted of serial killing to have the option of pleading guilty to a lesser charge if they agree to give the location of bodies or give details of what happened to the victims so that the families can get whatever semblance of relief they can get, right, from knowing the details. Some families want to know those details, others do not. So it's really very particular. That's why you see so many of our serial killers here in the United States are on are in life in prison, and they aren't typically allowed with the general population of the prison because they are very, I mean, they're targets. Um, there is that code in prison. There's a very strict code in prison where if you have killed children, abused elderly people, you are absolutely not tolerated. You will be a target, and you're killed in horrible ways. You're killed, and they find a way to do it, right? But if you are on death row, you are also completely isolated from everybody, from anybody. You get 1 hour a day outside, and most of the time you're in there with an armed guard. And there's always an armed guard in the tower if it's one of those prisons, which most of them have a tower where they always have one or two officers up there, prison guards with their guns, and they can pretty much pick anybody off anywhere around that prison. And so it's heavily guarded. They're definitely in solitary confinement, especially death penalty cases. There's no doubt that they're in solitary confinement. So, and honestly, they do well in that environment as well because all their choices are taken away. If you recall when we talked about being in the military, their choices are taken away. But there is that whole system in prison where, like Jeffrey Dahmer, inmates were able to arrange for one of the men in their group. They're very cliquish in prison. One of the men in their group was willing to, he was in for life anyway, and he was willing to kill Dahmer. And part of the reason they want to do that is, Dahmer did kill and do horrific things to young boys. And that was their reasoning. One of the other things that compel prisoners to kill serial killers is that notoriety that comes with it. I don't know the man's name who killed Dahmer, but I'm sure there are people who do. To me, that's not that important. And I don't want to glamorize what happened. just for the sake of talking about it. I don't care who did it. It did happen. And in many of these cases, you'll see that, serial killers, if they're not killed by lethal injection or whatever that state has approved, they'll be killed in the general population if there's an opportunity for that to happen. And it does. It happens quite often. On May the 8th of 79, the jury found him guilty of 6 counts of first-degree murder, and they rejected the argument that he was not guilty by reason of insanity and sentenced him to die in the gas chamber. His fellow inmates, aware of the extremely violent and grisly nature of Chase's crimes, feared him, and, according to prison officials, often tried to persuade him to commit suicide. And that's interesting, too. We've seen quite a few people in the past who are in prison who have killed themselves. Not a serial killer, but Aaron Hernandez, the football player, it's believed that he hung himself. And then you have, oh my goodness, what is his name? Not Feinstein. She just passed away. I'm thinking of that man who, I think it was Jeffrey, maybe? Epstein. Jeffrey Epstein. He was the one that of course, was involved in all that human trafficking, young girls and all that. And he supposedly killed himself. But there's always been this speculation that they were murdered inside their cells because they're so heavily watched. They have, cameras watching them 24 hours a day to prevent this from happening. So how could someone sit there and make a noose out of their sheets and hang themselves? That's the most common way that they kill themselves in prison, because that's what's available to them, right? So interesting. Most of the time when I hear that a prisoner, especially in these big cases, that a prisoner has died by suicide in their cell, my mind just automatically goes to, no, they didn't kill themselves. They were murdered, and it was staged. And I firmly believe that in the majority of cases. Chase was granted a series of interviews with Robert Ressler, during which he spoke of his fears of Nazis and UFOs, claiming that although he had killed, it was not his fault. He had been forced to kill to keep himself alive, which he believed any person would do. He asked Ressler to give him access to a radar gun with which he could apprehend the Nazi UFOs so that the Nazis could stand trial for the murders. He also handed Ressler a large amount of macaroni and cheese, which he had been hoarding in his pants pockets, believing that the prison officials were in league with the Nazis and attempting to kill him with poisoned food. Again, fantastic evidence of someone who was completely mentally unstable. We know that he was getting prescribed medications in prison because on December 26, 1980, he was found dead in his prison cell, and an autopsy revealed that he killed himself with an overdose of prescribed medications. So we know that he had enough prescribed medications to kill himself. What he probably did was, when they would come around and give him his doses, he hoarded them up. And then he hoarded enough of them up that where he was positive that if he took them, it would kill him. And of course, he was right. That's very common, and you will see that in a lot of cases of people. They've done a lot of things. Now they do a lot of things to ensure that medication is taken. Someone usually has to stay in the room with them, and they have to stick their tongue out, and they look down their throat, and they look under the tongue so that they cannot, hoard the drugs. But that's a pretty common thing. Again, Richard Chase was known as the vampire killer, and he did exhibit sociopathic tendencies since his childhood. And it was around age 10 that we mentioned earlier that he started displaying the characteristics of the McDonald triad. Small fires, taking pleasure in hurting animals and birds, and bedwetting. He grew up displaying extremely psychopathic behaviors, and it's these cases. This is a textbook case for me that proves that we have a long, long way to go with our mental system, our mental health system, in connection with our prison systems. I mean, there's so much reformation that needs to happen, but I understand it's going to take years and understanding and a lot of money. But you are saving lives, not only the lives of the psychopathic people, but the lives of their potential victims, right? The prison system is broken just as badly. When we let people out who have these violent histories saying that they've been reformed, statistically, that type of reformation does not happen. And even if they release them on medication and they've been an outstanding prisoner, once they're released back out into the general public with no supervision and guarantee that they're going to take their medication, these are the type of things we see. We see these serial killings. We see these horrible, totally disturbed actions that really could have been prevented had the system worked like it should. It was said that, it doesn't say who said this, but I'm just going to say that it's probably people like me, experts on development, experts in criminology, like Dunn, those type of things. His psychopathic behavior was indicative of him becoming a murderer. It was laid out. Of course, we're looking at this, hindsight's 2020, but literally he fits almost every single characteristic of a potential serial killer that we are aware of. He hits all of those. So what can we learn from him? What can we learn from him? If we have a child in the school system right now who is displaying this psychopathic behavior, who has a tendency to be violent, who has not experienced anybody trying to help them with this attributional retraining that we know about, why are we not doing anything? Or is it that we're trying to do things but we're not doing enough because no one wants to say that kid is heading towards a very negative future if things don't change? He's displaying the same characteristics of serial killers, and we joke about it. We joke about it amongst ourselves in schools. We joke about, oh my gosh, I had that kid when he was in, kindergarten, and if there was ever a student who was going to come back and try to find me when he gets older, it would be this kid because he hated me. Or we say those things. I've heard them. I've said them. It's not really funny. It's not funny because we know it happens. And if what we can do in the classroom is so powerful, why aren't we doing it? Why aren't we making these differences? Why aren't we implementing things in the classroom to help with this antisocial behavior? I'm not saying we're trying to make people, every single person that comes through our classroom, a people person. That's not what I mean. There's a very healthy level of being an introvert. I know a lot of introverts who are just normal, wonderful people. They just don't like to talk a lot. They also don't like to be in big crowds with people. A small, intimate crowd is what they like. Nothing wrong with that. We all are different. I tend to be kind of in the middle. I'm an extrovert most of the time, but I also enjoy my time alone. I can be an extrovert, um,